I must say that it is a particularly delightful session for us in Play the Game to introduce, because for many years we have tried to achieve that representatives of FIFA and people with close affiliation to FIFA would enter into the public debate about FIFA affairs. And we have, of course, like everybody else, noted the positive movements that are taking place in FIFA currently. And we are particularly grateful that now two of the main drivers of FIFA reform have come here to, as I know, the first time together to present the core proposals that can really make a change in FIFA. The gentlemen that you are going to hear are not the end responsibles of actually voting the FIFA reforms, but they surely have a very strong mandate in suggesting what kind of change FIFA should go through. And I would therefore give a special thanks to Dr. Theo Zwanziger and to Professor Pieth for joining us in this session. We look very much forward to hearing what it is all about in FIFA. You have the inside knowledge that we are so hungry to get, and perhaps there will be a bit of it that you can share with us. Now, yesterday we complained about those sports officials who had been in charge since the mid-1970s. Oh, sorry, I should say one thing. I promised to say for Theo Zwanziger, he will speak in German and there will be consecutive translating. And this is simply because the FIFA reforms is, of course, a very sensitive political and professional issue where he would like to express himself freely and precisely, and that is better in German. So those of you who understand German will have a double advantage and a double lecture. And now back to those, let's call them dinosaurs that we were talking about from the mid-1970s. To chair this session, we have actually chosen another kind of dinosaur, a more flexible one, a very close partner, who has, while these people were in charge of the sports organization, he has, since the mid-1970s, actually followed their steps, monitored them closely, and written a lot of interesting papers about sports governance. And we are happy to count Professor Jean-Loup Chappelet from IDHEAP in Lausanne, which is a school of public administration. To have him here, we also, Chappelet is also a very appreciated, very dear partner in our action for good governance in international sports, the EU preparatory action, and he is, by the way, also chairing various governance sessions during the EASM Conference here. So, without further ado, Professor Chappelet, you will make the further introductions, and thanks a lot for sharing this session.
But now I know. So my role is basically to introduce the speakers and then to take your questions and lead the question and answer session. So we will start with Dr. Zwanziger, Theo Zwanziger, who is a member of the FIFA Exco Executive Committee and also UEFA Executive Committee. He's a lawyer by training and was a sport official all his life. And he was finally the president of the German Football Association for 6 years, from 2006 to 2012. In 2010, among other things, he founded the Theo Zwanziger Foundation for Girls and Women's Football, and maybe you would want to say a few words about that. In 2011, he became a member of the FIFA Executive Committee, and now is also the chairman of the task force in charge of reforming the statutes of FIFA. So this is a very important position, reporting actually to the governance commission that we will hear about later because it is chaired by Professor Pieth. So without further ado, I will give you the floor, Dr. Zwanziger. Thank you very much in advance.
No, jeg har ellers fået mikrofoner til på det.
Ja, good morning. Das schaffen wir. Wir sind soweit.
Ja, ich bin bereit.
Ja, guten Morgen, meine Damen und Herren. Vielen Dank für die freundliche Einführung. Ich spreche in der Tat lieber in Deutsch, weil das Thema ist sensibel und aktuell. Und deshalb will ich bei meiner Wortwahl hier auch sicher sein, dass ich es verantworten kann, gerade in einem noch laufenden Prozess.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the kind invitation to come here and talk to you today. I prefer to speak in my mother tongue German as the topic is very sensible and political, and that's why I would prefer to express myself freely in my mother tongue, and you can hear it through translation in English.
Die Arbeitstitel Ihres Programms, Board between Business and Civil Society, Democracy, Transparency, Western Privilege or Global Values. Meine Damen und Herren, die kann man eigentlich mit einem Satz beantworten. Natürlich ist es völlig klar, dass wir Demokratie und Transparenz global sehen wollen und müssen, in allen Staaten dieser Welt und natürlich auch in den Zivilgesellschaften. Man braucht doch nur in die Charta der Menschenrechte von 1948 zu schauen. Da steht eigentlich alles drin.
The question and the topic we have today about democracy and governance and values. This question can easily be answered. Actually, you can just look in the Charter from 1948 about human rights, and then you will find all the answers in there.
Wer wie ich 1945 in Deutschland geboren ist, der weiß, was Demokratie und Menschenrechte bedeuten. Und deshalb habe ich versucht, mit meinen entscheidenden Mitteln in den Jahren meines Wirkens in der Politik und in den Sportverbänden mich auch ein Stück dafür einzusetzen.
I was born in Germany in 1945, and being born in 1945, I really know what democracy means. And I have tried in all these years I've been working in politics and in the sportive world to try and improve the situation within the sportive world and democracy.
Wir alle wissen, meine Damen und Herren, wenn wir uns umsehen, dass wir von einer so beschriebenen heilen Welt weit entfernt sind. Aber das darf nicht zur Resignation führen, sondern uns ganz im Gegenteil ermutigen, jeder an seiner Stelle den notwendigen Beitrag zu leisten.
We all know that we live in a not so perfect world, and that shouldn't lead to resignation. On the other hand, it should be a challenge to us to try to improve the situation and try to make a better world together.
Sportverbände, meine Damen und Herren, unterscheiden sich nach meiner Einschätzung in einem ganz wesentlichen Punkt von staatlichen Demokratien. Das liegt darin, dass man darin begründet, dass man das Wechselspiel zwischen Regierung und Opposition, Machterhalt, Machtbalance, Machtaustausch so nicht kennt.
One of the reasons that we have a different situation in the sportive world than in the public sector, like in politics, is that you don't have the same kind of balance with elections every now and then, where you can get from one government to the opposition, but you have a more continued picture in the sportive world, and you don't have the balance there.
Wenn Sie in einer staatlichen Demokratie politisch tätig sind, und sich um Mandate bewerben, Minister werden wollen, dann wissen Sie, dass Sie an einem Tag Minister sein können, aber morgen in der Opposition. Entscheidungen treffen die Wähler, alle, in ihrer Gesamtheit.
If you're trying to run for public office and you want to be a minister in a government, then you know that one day you can be a minister and the next day you can find yourself in the opposition. You will always have to look at the vote from the voter and they will give you the verdict of where your place will be.
Wenn Sie in einem Sportverband das Glück haben wie ich, Präsident zu werden eines Landesverbandes und dann später des Deutschen Fußballbundes, dann bleiben Sie das in aller Regel so lange, bis Sie keine silbernen Löffel geklaut haben oder den Verband massiv beschädigt haben. Sportkameradschaft ist sehr, sehr schwierig in kritische Verhaltensweisen zu verändern. Man hält zusammen, weil man zusammengehört und zu Recht, manchmal auch zu Unrecht, davon überzeugt ist, dass der Auftrag, der einem erteilt wurde, auch gut erfüllt wird.
When you are so lucky as I have been first to be the leader of a state federation for football and later for the Federal Federation of Football in Germany, then you know that you are working to fulfill the obligations, and it's very hard to remove someone in that post. If you haven't stolen any silver spoons, or if you haven't really mismanaged your task in a critical way, then you will be sitting there until you choose to step down yourself. And you should keep on working for the goals to work for a good situation for everyone within the sportive world.
Aus dieser nüchternen Beschreibung ergibt sich für Sportverbände nach meiner Einschätzung die Pflicht, Konsequenzen abzuleiten, die innere Reformprozesse intensiv in Gang setzen, weiterführen und damit und auf diese Art und Weise das nicht vorhandene Wechselspiel zwischen Regierung und Opposition ein Stück ersetzen.
You have the obligation to look out for reforms within your working area in order to fulfill the lack you have of the ever-changing situation between being in government or in opposition, and in that way reform the sportive world.
Gerade weil Sport nach meiner persönlichen festen Überzeugung, und ich denke, Sie stimmen dem zu, eine riesige Chance hat, zur Verständigung von Völkern, von Menschen überall rund um den Globus beizutragen. Gerade deshalb sind solche innere Reformprozesse unverzichtbar, weil sie letztendlich über das eigene Klientel hinaus Ansehen in der Gesellschaft vermitteln können und müssen.
Such reforms are so necessary because the sportive world has so much attention, and there are so many friends who are looking at sportive world, and I'm sure you agree with me on that. And it is our obligation to work for improvement through reforms.
Sport, meine Damen und Herren, und gerade der Fußball wird längst nicht mehr ausschließlich danach bewertet, was auf dem Platz passiert. Das Spiel, der Wettbewerb. Also, wenn man so will, das Wort verwende ich nicht so gerne, aber es wird verwendet und es beschreibt die Situation, das Kerngeschäft des Sports. Das funktioniert. Es wird geordnet, es wird geregelt und bei Fehlverhalten werden die Spieler bestraft. Sichtbar, transparent.
The competition within our area, the sportive competition, if there are mistakes there, then you will see that they will be punished very visibly. I don't like to call it the core business of our area, but it actually is.
Was nicht immer funktioniert, meine Damen und Herren, ist das, was außerhalb des Platzes passiert, durch die die Regeln setzen und sie kontrollieren sollen. Das heißt, die Offiziellen, die Verantwortlichen in den Präsidien, in den Vorständen, in den Kommissionen. Auch Offizielle prägen durch ihr Verhalten, durch ihr Tun und die Darstellung dessen, was sie tun. Natürlich den Sport und gestalten sein Image ein Stück mit.
What you don't always see is the official side, the administration within the sportive world. But the actions of the officials, they will actually be seen all through the sportive spectrum, also in the games. And it is very important actually to be monitoring what is going on also on the official side.
Transparenz, meine Damen und Herren, ist der Feind der Korruption. Und deshalb habe ich, als mich im Sommer 2011, das ist alles erst etwas mehr als ein Jahr her, Sepp Blatter anlässlich der Frauen-WM in Deutschland fragte, ob ich mich an diesem Prozess der Reformen der FIFA beteiligen wollte, gesagt, ja, wenn klare Grundprinzipien erfüllt werden und erfüllt werden sollen.
In 2011, the championship for women took place, and Sepp Blatter asked if I would like to be part of the reform process within FIFA. And initially I would say transparency is actually the enemy of corruption. But when I was asked this question by Mr. Blatter, I said, yes, I would like to be part of this, but only if some fundamental principles will be fulfilled.
Die erste und wichtigste Voraussetzung war für mich, das hatte ich auch vorher schon öffentlich gesagt, nach den Diskussionen um die Wahlen, um die WM-Vergaben, um die ISL-Akte. Vertrauen ist nur zu gewinnen, wenn eine externe, unabhängige Expertengruppe diesen Prozess begleitet. Wenn das nicht geschieht, kann alles noch so gut gemacht werden. Das wird in der Kommunikation von niemandem verstanden und es wird nicht akzeptiert. Reformen brauchen Akzeptanz und diese Akzeptanz muss auf diese Weise extern hergestellt werden.
In connection with various cases and files, we have seen that there's a need for reforms, and the only way that we can actually get through with reforms is that we have an independent body monitoring what is going on in the reform work, and reforms really have to be accepted widely. And these reforms will only be accepted if we have an independent body monitoring it. If that is not the case, nobody will understand what is said, and there will be actually no changes.
Ich bin dankbar, dass mit Mark Pieth und dieser ganzen großen Gruppe, die alle gar nicht kennen, diese externe Beratung stattgefunden hat, auch im Konflikt. Auch im Konflikt, und dass wir, die wir uns dort kennengelernt haben, inhaltlich im Wesentlichen in die gleiche Richtung denken. Er von draußen, diese FIFA betrachtend, ich mehr von innen kommend und den Weg von Sportfunktionären, glaube ich, recht genau kenne.
I'm happy that together with Mr. Pieth and also with other people I don't know yet have been able to enter into this process to make reforms. And was haben Sie noch gesagt da? Den letzten Teil des Satzes, können Sie den nochmal?
Müssen wir noch mal kurz zurückblenden. Ich war jetzt schon beim nächsten.
Sorry.
Dass der Pieth von außen drauf guckt. Und
Ja, ich wäre den Weg aus der Funktionärslaufbahn.
Yeah. Of course, some people are looking more from the external side into this this work, where I come from the internal side and see all the structures about the people working for the FIFA.
Und da muss ich Ihnen etwas ganz offen sagen. Weil die Verbände, meine Damen und Herren, halt so sind, wie sie sind. Sie kennen halt nicht Opposition und Regierung. Ist es ganz entscheidend, ob ein Präsident, ein Präsidium, ein Exekutivkomitee Reformen will und sie umzusetzen bereit ist. Wenn das nicht der Fall ist, ist es ungemein schwierig. Denn Ausreden, etwas nicht zu tun, weil man ja eigentlich alles gut macht, die gibt es immer.
Because the federations don't know this kind of opposition that you see in politics with governments and opposition working together, then you will always have the focus on the president of what is done. Also der Satz, der war ziemlich lang.
Na ja, dann lassen wir das.
That it was decisive to have the support of the President and the Executive Committee for the reforms, because otherwise nothing would happen.
Thank you.
Was haben wir gemacht? Und was ist noch zu tun? Da wird Professor Pieth sicher noch einiges aus seinem Blickwinkel dazu sagen. Für mich war ein erster Schritt sehr wichtig.
So what can we do? I'm sure that Professor Pieth will also talk about that later. But this initial step to initiate this work, I think, was very, very important.
Dieser Schritt ist nicht überall in seiner Bedeutung so wahrgenommen worden, wie er tatsächlich ist.
Not everybody has seen how important this first step is, but it actually is very important.
Macht muss geteilt und abgegeben werden.
Power should be shared, and you should also be able to delegate some power out.
Im Begriff der Gewaltenteilung zu reden, haben wir Parlament, Regierung und Rechtsprechung.
You have the separation of powers, and you have a parliament, and you have the judicial, and you have these three areas within politics to manage the society.
Im Sport gibt es im Wesentlichen eine Rechtsprechung für das, was auf dem Platz an Fehlverhalten passiert.
In the sportive world, you mainly have a kind of judicial system on the football field or wherever it is in order to correct those mistakes that are made there.
Was das Verhalten von offiziellen oder ethischen Maßstäben betrifft, gab es das so nicht.
When we are looking at the ethical side, we can say we have not had that kind of system established there.
Zwar hatte die FIFA ein Ethikreglement,
FIFA has had some regulations about ethics.
seit 2006 in einer kurzen Fassung, seit 2009 in einer schon deutlich präziseren Fassung, aber diese Ethikreglements waren nicht justiziabel. Es gab keine Anklagebehörde in dem Sinne, dass unabhängig bei Fehlverhalten eingegriffen werden kann.
FIFA has had some ethical regulations since 2006. They were quite basic from 2006, and then they were more specific since 2009. However, the system to work with these ethical standards and to really make decisions when something wrong was made, they didn't exist. And it's necessary to establish a system that can really use these regulations to produce some results.
Jetzt haben wir verabschiedet vor wenigen Wochen mit tatkräftiger und nachhaltiger Unterstützung des Präsidenten. Ich will nicht aus den Interna des Excos plaudern. Nicht bei jedem ist die große Begeisterung ausgebrochen. Ein neues, umfassendes Ethikreglement.
A few weeks ago, with full support from the President, we decided upon a new ethical regulation that is much more broadly formulated. And I must say, well, of course, I don't want to speak about internal matters within my area, but not everybody was quite supportive about this decision.
Und das ethische Verhalten von Offiziellen, übrigens nicht nur der Offiziellen der FIFA, sondern alle der FIFA zugeordneten Verbände, das Ethikreglement gilt auch für den DFB, wird kontrolliert jetzt von unabhängigen Persönlichkeiten.
This ethical regulation, it doesn't only apply to FIFA and to the federations under FIFA. For example, it also applies to the DFB, the German Football Federation. And now, as it is suggested, it should be controlled by independent bodies.
Die Macht hat sich also ein Stück verschoben in diesem Bereich des Untersuchens, des Kontrollierens und gegebenenfalls auch des Bestrafens, in jedem Fall dem Nachgehen von Verdachtsmomenten von einer präsidial gesteuerten Administration hin zu unabhängigen Experten.
So the power has actually been moved a little bit. It has gone from being very governed by the president of the federation, and now it goes to independent bodies so that they can take care of investigations and also in the end look at possible sanctions for mistakes made.
Mein Wunsch und meine Hoffnung ist es, dass die dort jetzt berufenen Verantwortlichen für die Untersuchung von Fehlverhalten und auch zur Bestrafung gegebenenfalls ihre Arbeit ernst nehmen und sich engagiert mit diesen Fragen befassen, transparent befassen, aufklären, anklagen oder einstellen und auf diese Art und Weise für die Zukunft, aber auch für einige offene Felder aus der Vergangenheit ein Stück Vertrauen gewinnen und zurückgewinnen für die Arbeit der FIFA, die ja weltumspannend in ihrem sportlichen und sozialen Bereich sicherlich sehr, sehr viel Positives leistet.
I really hope that these people who now will be in charge of investigating mistakes that are made and also looking at possible sanction or penalties, I hope they will take this task very seriously so that we can continue with the good work we have seen in FIFA, and we can say that FIFA has already done a whole lot of good over the years, and I hope that that will continue also in the future.
Der Reformprozess ist damit nicht zu Ende, auch wenn aus meiner Sicht ein großer Schritt gemacht ist.
The process of reforms is not over here, but I can say that I think a big step has already been taken in the right direction.
Wir streben die weiteren Schritte für den Kongress 2013 an.
The next steps will be initiated in preparation of the Congress 2013.
Wenn du das Verhalten von Offiziellen über das Ethikreglement untersuchst und bei Fehlverhalten ahndest, dann ist es natürlich noch besser zu wissen, wie ist denn der Leumund von Personen, die, wenn sie gewählt werden sollen, Ämter übernehmen in FIFA und den Verbänden. Also, auf der einen Seite haben wir das Fehlverhalten von Leuten, die in den Ämtern sind. Besser ist es natürlich, erst einmal zu prüfen, ob die Damen und Herren, die Ämter übernehmen, auch von ihrem Leumund her gut beurteilt sind.
So of course you can look at that you should have sanctions or penalties towards people who are not acting the way they should, but it would be much better already before these people are elected to be officials in FIFA, that you can see that they work into the right direction and don't have any problems on board already when they enter their official title.
Also der Beginn einer Funktionärslaufbahn in diesen Ämtern mit hoher Verantwortung und großer Ausstrahlung auf Millionen Menschen, die auch nicht zu diesen Verbänden gehören, muss geprüft werden, genau wie das Verhalten während der Laufbahn.
So you should control these people or investigate these people before they start their career as officials within FIFA. And you should also investigate and control them all the way through when they are elected officials. They of course have a very visible face towards the world in the job that they are taking care of.
Und wenn diese beiden Stufen durchlaufen sind, dann muss natürlich eine dritte Stufe kommen. Und das ist das Bestimmen des Endes einer Laufbahn.
After the two initial steps, of course, there is also a third step coming, and that is to determine when should the career end.
Es ist ganz klar, dort wo das Wechselspiel von Opposition und Regierung durch Wahlen nicht so funktioniert wie im staatlichen Leben im Allgemeinen, brauchst du andere Mechanismen.
It is obvious when you don't have elections like in the public society where you have a change of powers every now and then you really need a system to control that you will have novelty also into our part of the world.
Warum, meine Damen und Herren? Weil das Verbinden und langjährige Ausüben solcher Ämter natürlich auch und zwangsläufig Gefahren in sich trägt.
And that is of course because when you are in office for so many years, there will be dangerous situations every now and then that you have to face.
Sportverbände brauchen Innovation. Die werden auch durch den Wechsel von Persönlichkeiten in unterschiedlichsten Ämtern herbeigeführt.
It is very necessary to have new people into the situation, into the sportive world. So it is very important not to have the same people sitting in office all the time.
Da gibt es zwei Mechanismen: Altersgrenze oder Amtszeitbegrenzung.
There are two kind of mechanisms here. Either you can say that a person has to stop when he or she reaches a certain age, or you can determine already initially how many years should the person be in office.
Darüber wird in den nächsten Monaten in den Verbänden und Konföderationen diskutiert werden müssen, weil unser Satzungsentwurf ja bereits dem Kongress im Mai vorgelegt worden ist.
We have to discuss that in the federations and confederations because our draft for the statute has already been presented in May to whom? An wen wurde das präsentiert?
An den Kongress im Mai.
To the Congress, that was in May.
Einer von diesen beiden Punkten muss kommen. Ich persönlich mache keinen Hehl daraus, dass ich eher Anhänger einer Amtszeitbegrenzung bin, weil ich die Altersbegrenzung irgendwo auch ein Stück für diskriminierend halte.
One of the solutions we'll have to make, and I must say that I really am pro having a determined period of years that you can be in office. If you choose the solution where you have to go when you reach a certain age, I see that as a form of discrimination actually.
Ein 40-Jähriger kann mit den Früchten eines Amtes mit 50 genauso verheiratet sein wie ein 60-Jähriger mit 70. Also deshalb eher Amtszeitbegrenzung.
You can compare a person who is 40 years old and working for 10 years. He can be just as good when he is 50 as somebody who is 60 and works until he's 70. So I would really say I go in for the number of years to determine how long time you can be in office.
Wenn alle Funktions- und Amtsträger die Bereitschaft hätten, nach einer gewissen Zeit, nämlich dann, wenn es am schönsten ist, zu sagen, jetzt höre ich auf, dann ließe sich das Problem vielleicht einfacher lösen.
It probably would be much easier to have a solution to this problem if everybody would say, oh, when the situation is the very best, I will stop.
Aber die Erkenntnis, die ich im Moment genieße, wenn du loslässt, dann hast du die Hände wieder frei, die ist nicht sehr weit verbreitet.
But the situation that I know now, when you stop, then suddenly you have plenty of time on your hands, and that is not a very common approach.
Zusammenfassend aus meiner Sicht, ich glaube, dass wir in den Kernbereichen einer Reform der FIFA und damit des Fußballs und irgendwo auch ein Stück des Sports insgesamt vorankommen.
I think in the reform work of FIFA and in the sportive world, in some way we will at least come one step further into the right direction.
Wir brauchen dafür Augenmaß, Überzeugungskraft und auch die kritische Begleitung von außen.
We need a vision here, and we need to convince, but we also need to have people following us from outside.
Es macht keinen Sinn, diesen populistischen Forderungen nachzulaufen. Am besten schmeißt man alle raus, dann ist das Problem gelöst. Das Problem wäre nicht gelöst, denn die Strukturen würden auch in der Zukunft von anderen Menschen in ähnlicher Weise genutzt.
It doesn't make sense to follow the populistic approach to say we could solve all the problems by just throwing everybody out. Because if you did that, you would still have the structures and you would just fill those positions with new people and the same problems would continue.
Deshalb bitte ich zum Schluss auch um Ihre, soweit Sie das tun wollen, kritische Begleitung, aber auch, meine Damen und Herren, ein Stück respektvoll vor vielen Menschen, die in diesem Fußballgeschehen Verantwortung übernommen haben, die mit ihrer Lebensleistung, ihrer Begeisterung an diesem Fußballgeschehen wirken und bitte nicht den Versuch machen, sie alle über einen Kamm zu scheren.
So I really will ask you all to be critical followers of this process, but don't make the mistake to criticize people only for they really have entered into this work because they have a burning desire for football and sports, and that actually should continue to the benefit of everybody.
Ich bin jung in diesem Exekutivkomitee, habe viele Kollegen inzwischen bei der FIFA kennengelernt, auch sehr engagierte Persönlichkeiten, die in die gleiche Richtung denken. Und ich habe bei der FIFA hauptamtliche Verantwortungsträger kennen und schätzen gelernt, zu denen ich sehr, sehr viel Vertrauen habe. Also schauen wir, was die Zukunft uns noch bringt. Vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit.
We just have to take the last one also. I haven't been in the FIFA Executive Board for a very long time, but during my very short time there, I have really met some very, very nice people, some very engaged people. They have been working hard for the common goals, and I really have full trust to everybody who's working in that area. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Zwanziger, and good luck. We keep the questions and comments for the end of the session. And now I would like to present and introduce Professor Marc Pieth from Switzerland, Professor of Criminal Law at the University of Basel since 1993, almost 20 years already. Before that, he's not only an academic, he was also a practitioner. He was head of the section for economic and organized crime at the Swiss Federal Office of Justice, which is the Ministry of Justice and Police. He is a member, or he was a member of the GAFI, Financial Action Task Force of OECD, and also a chairman of the OECD Working Group on Bribery in International Business. Now he's a member of the Integrity Advisory Board of the World Bank, and he was also a dean of his faculty at the University of Basel. A copy of his paper in the Financial Times, or his short paper in the Financial Times, or Ed, I should say, was distributed earlier, so this gives you also an idea of what he was going to talk about. So I give you the floor now. Thank you very much in advance.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Dear colleagues, dear friends, I'd like to thank the organizers for having invited me here, and I think it is indeed quite challenging to have this kind of double conference with Dr. Zwanziger, and you can see how this process is dovetailing into each other. I think this opportunity is particularly welcome because there have been some misunderstandings in the past. Maybe we're able to correct some of them. You've heard from the CV that has been given that I'm coming from a totally different area. I'm not a footballer. I'm not even a fan in a great extent. I'm watching from afar. I've never been in any football regulatory institution whatsoever. My background is something quite different at a quite ugly part of the world. It's organized crime, terrorism, corruption. Corruption is maybe the softest of all that, and I'm still chairing this OECD working group on bribery since about 22 years. And over the time we've come to realize that law enforcement is a very heavy-handed tool, especially in combating bribery, and this has led me to start talking to companies. And I'm mentioning this merely to make you understand why I'm at all engaged in this process. We started off as monitors of companies. I have a company, a very big company, a construction company of 70,000 people worldwide, and I'm reporting to the US Army and US Air Force on their behavior and making them recommendations so that they are able to change their behavior. And this, in effect, is the starting point of our engagement in FIFA. I think that you just have to see where we come from, and if I say we, the people I'm using to help me are this institute that we have created at a university in Basel, the Basel Institute on Governance. Let me start where I start in the paper that has been distributed, this piece that I had written for the Financial Times called "We Can at Last Show a Red Card to Sporting Corruption." Where I would like to start off is on sports regulators. We all know that IOC, FIFA and others were actually in quite a bit of trouble up to the 1960s. It was uncertain whether they would really make ends meet. FIFA in particular was financially not really well off. A lot was quite uncertain. With the new media and the new marketing tools, of course, everything changed. That's what you've been talking about yesterday. Suddenly these organizations were swamped with money, and typically the organizational structure that they had remained the same. They were at least those 60 plus organizations that you'd have in Switzerland. They are simple associations, and they remain simple associations. Something that a group of friends would be, I've called them a hunting club or whatever. There are other expressions I could use, but it's basically an organizational structure that we would use if we're 3 people plus, maybe 50 people, if we have a cycling club or whatever, and they are in this structure. What comes on top of it is that they are hardly or not paying taxes because they are non-profit organizations. It beats me, frankly, how you can be a non-profit and have reserves of over $1 billion francs or dollars or euros. This is quite a challenge. Anyway, so they have remained in those structures. Now, they had to spend a lot of that money that they're earning very quickly. One has to say that in the times of transformation, and now I'm talking about the years between the 70s and now, in those times when the transformation took place, not only sports organizations but also international business was highly corrupt. We just have to see this. I'm talking about the recipient side, I'm also talking about the side of the payers. Until 2000, bribing foreign public officials, even officials, was not an offense. Even in squeaky clean Denmark, there was not an offense on bribing foreign officials. What's more, in most countries in the world, it was quite okay to deduct bribes from taxes. Oh, we had to pay expenses. That's what the status is up to 2000. Now, I think this is absolutely despicable, and frankly, since 1989, I've been trying to, with the OECD, trying to change this situation for the wider business area, and we're quite proud that we managed to change the laws to the extent that Siemens, MAN, Ferrostahl, ABB, Halliburton, you name it, have been brought to justice. This is on the state side. Turning back to the sports organizations, they remained under-regulated. Typically, they did not fall under the definition of a public international organization. They are not like the UN, they're not the European Union or whatever. And if you look at private corruption, well, you know, those rules are made for commercial activities, and of course we might like to say it's quasi-commercial what they're doing, but still it doesn't really fit the concept. So we're in trouble, and we have to we should create new rules. We are until current days confronted with a huge risk exposure, let's face it, a traditional structure that is, well, open to patronage. What does that mean? I would not use the word mafia. I would use patronage as the concept. It means helping friends who vote for you into positions of power. Okay? You don't need to kill anybody for that, but it is something that is very, very, it's fundamentally wrong, and it brings us into big difficulties. And we have minimal internal and external regulation. This has already been mentioned. This applies to most sports regulators across the world, and especially those based in Switzerland. I can say this being a Swiss professor. This is one of our legacies, just as other problems we are facing, like money laundering and so on, have been. Now, the IOC, you've heard, I think yesterday, we've been talking about it a bit, has under similar pressure as FIFA, after the problems faced in Salt Lake City, made an effort to reorganize. I don't think they're finished yet. I'll put it this way, but I don't want to be nasty. That's a different discussion. I'm concentrating on FIFA, and it's FIFA's turn to reorganize currently. Now, how could this be done? Let me start with you. Civil society, the media are absolutely necessary. They're very useful in raising the temperature on these bodies. But frankly, the push in the IOC did not come from the civil society alone. It came because the US law enforcement started taking action, and then suddenly there was a move. Authorities, that would be a good idea. Let's try. Well, we have tried. I've been extensively speaking to the Swiss authorities whether they're ready to regulate the 60-plus sports organizations based there. They are doing something. They will come up with a report towards the end of the year proposing some kind of minimal regulation. But they're not very hot in pursuit of this issue. What is more, their major, let's say, partners, if I look at the Council of Europe and look at countries like Germany, the UK or France, they're not bending over backwards or rushing into action at the moment. And frankly, some years back, in my role as the chair of the OECD Working Group on Bribery, I was confronted with a demand by the IOC. Please do something against corruption in sports in the OECD, because there you've got all those strong exporting countries. You could do something and you have a tough monitoring mechanism. Well, the same countries that I've just mentioned have said no, simply. And so, I mean, you have to just face this. The public sector is not willing to act, at least not in a given time frame. What more would we have? Well, we could turn to sponsors. Maybe there are some representatives of sponsors here. It's true that sponsors could be annoyed to an extent that they realize that linking their name to a given sports organization is going to be adverse for their aim. I've tested it with the sponsors to FIFA. But let's be very frank here. Investing in the next major sporting event means you're only going to withdraw when you have hard evidence that you're harming yourself. And the sponsors of FIFA don't think that they are at that point. So, what are we left with? And it's really, I think we have to face this. It's called self-regulation. That's what is on at the moment. There is little alternative. You may think, well, self-regulation, soft option. True, but there is something to say, how can we toughen it up? And I'll come to that at the very end of my talk. I'll sketch to you what self-regulation means at the moment, but the question is, the challenge for us is, how can we help them? How can we make them move? Let's admit that at this very point in time, self-regulation is the only realistic option we have in the case of FIFA, certainly. And we also have to admit it's a very difficult transition, because the old ways, in inverted commas, are still very present. And what is more, some of the old people, and with old I don't necessarily mean age, I mean the people who've been there and have been doing business in the old ways are still present, and not all of them like what we are suggesting to them. There is, I can be maybe more explicit there than somebody within the organization can be. There is resistance, quite direct resistance. Turning to the FIFA reform, it hinges on an inside element and an external element. That you've heard, Dr. Zwanziger has illustrated it. There were 4 task forces, of which some of them are more marginal to the effort that we're talking about here. Dr. Zwanziger's group on statutes is absolutely center stage. There was another one on compliance and another one on helping to bring this ethics, the new ethics code into effect. But your work is still absolutely fundamental, the change of the statutes, the reform of the statutes. Now, my own role, Jens has said, they are reporting to us. Well, okay, we are the outsiders. They know everything and they have the power within. We are the people looking at the process from outside. We have a certain influence by suggesting things. When I say we are 13 people, a mixed bag of, on the one hand, 6 governance experts, of which 4 NGO representatives, and a group of stakeholders, if you want. Stakeholders was the idea of Sylvia Schenk. You can't do it all alone, so you need stakeholders. So we have representatives of players, clubs, leagues, associations, and sponsors, and so on. Okay, the process itself has gone in 2 phases, of which one phase is close to finished, and this is quite essential. I have been, I think, misunderstood at the beginning when I said, sorry, I'm not, and this was essential for me, for my survival, I'm not going to raise expectation into the sky. I'm not Mr. Clean. I'm not going to clean up this myself. We are here as a kind of midwives, creating structures that will stay on when we leave. And we're going to leave after that Congress in next May, because then we have done our job. So our job is to create structures that will go on. I am not the person looking into the past, I had said at that time, but I'm very happy that we managed to put an institution in place that is credible to go on into the future. What do you need there? You need structures, separation of powers. That has been created in the statutes first and then in this ethics code, between investigation and prosecution, between investigation and adjudication. That's something we all know. We've learned that on the state level, in the last 200 years. You have to split the prosecutor from the judge. But what is at least as essential is separation of powers between the executive, if you want, Mr. Blatter, and the ExCo, on the one hand, and the judicial branch. They should not be able to influence what the judiciary does. This means the judiciary starts autonomously if they feel something needs to go ahead here. Excuse me. A new procedural order was drafted with quite a lot of detail drafted, and there needed to be independent chairs. There will also have to be a check on the other members of those 2 groups, but we chose to say one step at a time, because imagine if everything was to be changed immediately, this would have been a recipe for resistance, building up resistance, maximizing resistance. So at the moment we have an independent prosecutor and an independent judge, and our role, the role of the Independent Governance Committee, was to act as a kind of nomination committee. What you have described at the very end of your presentation, somebody has to check the due diligence of people. We can't have crooks taking over such jobs, so somebody had to look at them, and that was our role, to see who is valid. We submitted a list and checked on those people. Now, we did something else in this first phase. We suggested head of the Audit and Compliance Committee. Very essential, because the financial audit, but also the compliance structure, that's the next step. And they need to be in place already. We are now moving into the second phase. And this is, for me, let's say, the more challenging bit. Because it could well be that they say, oh fine, you've done your first bit now and that's it, let's stop the process. And it would be a huge pity if that happened. That would be really the catastrophe, because now we really need the governance structure for the future. What does that mean? I will be very short on that, because Dr. Zwanziger has mentioned several of those points. I will start at one point that I think is fundamental, though. We suggested that there needs to be an independent component in the executive committee, and I think your group went into absolutely the same direction. The question is, how do you bring that about? Because there's huge resistance against having independent people watching how the actual business is done. So an independent component, and what is more, we wanted to have the members of the executive committee originally elected by Congress, by the full constituency. It turned out very quickly that this was an absolute no-go because the confederations had a role. So what happened, we said, okay, well, the confederations suggest them, but they need to be ratified. They have to get the assent, the confirmation by Congress, and in between the two, you can do the vetting, the nomination. You can check on people. People who have a bad history will not get into the executive committee. That is the concept that is on the books. It's in your reform statutes at the moment, but it's uncertain whether it will work. And that's what I'm trying to tell you. If you want things like this to work, we need you. Next point, nomination committee, as you had mentioned, Dr. Zwanziger, is fine looking into the past and getting people to justice who have committed crimes, if you want, or committed offences in the past, but we have to prevent new people from coming in who have a shady past. So the nomination committee is absolutely fundamental. The structure is there. It's not yet quite clear where it's going to be located, but these need to be it needs to be an independent function. And by the way, it's something that any company, any multinational company, for instance, in the meantime has. Assuring fit and proper conduct of your top exponents is fundamental. Just to go down the list of components of this package that we're talking about at the moment, I won't give you all the details because it's quite a long list, but just to give you the sense of what we're talking about. There needs to be a clarification of rules how to elect the president. Issues like, when does he turn candidate? When does he stop having access to funds? He cannot use the funds of the institution to do a campaign and things like that. That has to be clarified beyond reasonable doubt. I won't talk about the age limits and the terms of office. That's already been done. We are also suggesting that remunerations, that this decision, a body deciding on the remunerations, just as you'd have in a big international corporation. And what is more, the remunerations of the top guys needs to be made public. This is a process that you have been following in multinational corporations. They've taken about 10 years to actually publish what the CEO or the president earns. This might not happen immediately, but it will happen. So I think there needs to be pressure. We're not only talking about accountability, we're also talking about transparency here. Of course, there are other points. If you go into the detail of this project, you will find, for instance, rules on the bidding process for marketing, but also for hosting of locations. It's a very difficult issue, really. By just shifting it from EXCO to the Congress, you haven't really done the job yet, because you will have to ask yourself, how are the files prepared? Who is actually suggesting? Because Congress will not choose from 10 options, they will choose from 2 options. More is not digestible by a group of 208 or 209, in fact. There is something more. This might be lost from vision. Development Committee. Well, you all know there are lots of little pots and funds, goal or whatever they're called, to sponsor, to help develop football across the world. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. What is a problem, though, is if the candidate for office goes to a continent and says, if you vote for me, you'll all have a new football pitch next year, or you'll get $1 million each. That's not going. That should not happen. So what are we suggesting? A single committee, out of hands of this, of the top guys, and they have to develop a long-term strategy, a 5-year plan or whatever. So you actually plan who is going to get a football pitch, and so it's not something you hand out as a present for potential voters. Of course, financial controls need to be upgraded. That is something where some steps have been taken already. And then we're moving into the nitty-gritty of what you find in business compliance structure. That's an issue for itself. That's what we've been doing with the big companies. And conflict of interest rules. It's crucial that people who take decisions that have an effect on money cannot at the same time personally be the beneficiaries. I mean, for most of us this is so obvious that we would not spend a minute or a second discussing this, but it is not clear for these sports organizations. They have to take that step to have an explicit conflict of interest rule, including all the declarations and so on. I'll just stop mentioning, stop on compliance by mentioning a whistleblower system belongs into any credible compliance structure, allowing anybody who has doubts to report. And this will trigger indirectly, this will bring it to the attention of the investigator. So the investigator can autonomously get started with the pre-investigation, but one has to have something to go by. I mean, the investigator is not spending all his time searching things. If people bring allegations to his attention, this is how he can get started. And this is really a sea change from the structure, as you had mentioned, that we have been confronted with earlier on. Now, I'm turning to the end of my speech. What's next? Well, structurally, the next steps are some of this stuff that we're doing, like compliance systems and conflict of interest structures, are in the competence of the ExCo. Some of it, of this package that I've been describing, is in a proposal to change the statutes yet more fundamentally, and that's up for the next Congress. That's basically what Dr. Zwanziger and his group are going to propose to the Congress with our backing. And until then, there is going to be a consultation procedure or consultation phase. And this is the point where I'm actually driving at. Dr. Zwanziger has invited you to critically accompany us in this process. I think he's very right. And I think both components are essential. Critically, yes, of course. And accompany. I would emphasize the second point a bit. I know this is self-regulation, and I'm personally facing the resistance of specific people. There are people fighting back who want to stop the whole thing, who want to stop at least where we are now. If you do believe that it makes sense to have anything that I've read out now as on the menu, then what we would need from you, and I'm saying criticize whatever, you can say it's not far enough, it's not enough, but what we need is pressure, public pressure, to do these things. If we stop where we are at the moment, this would be a huge pity, because you won't have another such chance in your lifetime, maybe. This is a real issue. So since we have no law enforcement agency ready, or the Swiss government in this case is not going to act in the pace we would wish, I'm inviting civil society, and especially the fans, to push for reforms, and it's fine talking, but we need action now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Pieth, for this insights into the second phase. I see there is a lot of work, and you said it has to be finished in 2013. So we wish you also good luck. Now I would invite the speakers to come to the table with the translator, I guess, who can sit in the middle. The organizer just gave us 10 minutes more for questions and answers. I'm sure there will be many. So please come to the table. And I will stay here to pass the floor. So when you ask a question or give a comment, please give your name and affiliation. This helps us to understand your question. Who wants to start? Yep.
I'm Torsten Thorsen from CBS Copenhagen Business School, and I'll ask you about democracy, because in the end of the day, it's the General Assembly who is electing the President and the people. In the European Union, you have realized that the big countries got more votes than the small countries. And I can see from my experience in the International Athletic Federation that one country, one vote is extremely dangerous. But on the other hand, the amendments is also hindering that you can change very much. So how would you have the ideal democratic voting system to be composed among big and small countries? Because I see the hindrance to be very big in this area.
Professor Pieth first, and then...
Wenn wir bei Null anfangen würden, wäre das Ganze richtig.
If we would start from zero, from scratch, then everything would be right.
Aber wir müssen nüchtern sehen, wir haben eine Verfassung und in dieser Verfassung gilt das Prinzip eine Stimme für jedes Land.
But we do have a constitution, and in the constitution it's written that there's one vote for each country.
Dies zu ändern, dafür brauchen Sie demokratisch eine satzungsändernde Mehrheit, 2/3 oder 3/4 der Stimmen. Die haben Sie nicht.
In order to change that, you would need to have a majority according to the statute, either a half or 2/3 or 3/4. You don't have that kind of majority.
Aus der Sicht der UEFA kann ich sagen, habe ich mir 2007 mal eine flapsige Bemerkung erlaubt in dem Zusammenhang. Ich bin ganz schön verprügelt worden von den Medien.
I came with a nasty remark in 2007 in UEFA about this, and the media actually really criticized me for that.
Dieser Theo Zwanziger hat keinen Respekt vor der Leistung der Kleinen.
Theo Zwanziger has no respect for what the small people are doing.
In der Praxis kann ich sagen, was die UEFA betrifft, gibt es ein sehr faires Abstimmungsprogramm, das man bei der Bildung der Gremien, also insbesondere des Exekutivkomitees, die stärkeren Länder, größeren Länder, auch die wirtschaftlich stärkeren Länder, ein Stück favorisiert, sodass man als Deutscher nicht klagen muss über die notwendige Verantwortung und Mitwirkung.
Actually, within UEFA we have a very fair system how to divide the powers, and they have a tendency of favorizing the larger countries, and we as Germans, we shouldn't really be complaining about that.
Bei der FIFA ist das noch viel schwieriger. Professor Pieth hat eben darauf hingewiesen, die bisherigen Mitglieder des Exekutivkomitees kommen ohne Legitimation der FIFA ausschließlich von den Konföderationen.
FIFA is a little bit different. If the executive committee doesn't agree otherwise, then there will only be representation from the federations.
Und die werden einen Teufel tun und ihre dort vorhandenen, auch auf diesem Einstimmenprinzip basierenden Strukturen zu verändern.
And they don't really have any interest at all in changing this system about one vote per country.
Deshalb, bei allem Verständnis für Ihre Vorstellung, im Moment gibt es Wichtigeres, wofür Sie Mehrheiten brauchen. Und deshalb wäre ein solches Thema zum jetzigen Zeitpunkt eher hinderlich, um das, was Herr Professor Pieth dargestellt hat, umzusetzen. Vielleicht kommen einmal andere Zeiten, um das dann aufzubauen.
Actually, the thing you have questioned here, I have sympathies for that, but it's not the right time to do it. We have really more pressing matters to look at right now, and as Professor Pieth was talking about, maybe we will see that the situation is better soon.
Professor Pieth, do you agree? Is it not the right time for this changing this voting system?
Yes, I can agree.
Okay, good. So, good point. So we keep the United Nations system. One country, one vote. Another question? Yeah, Robert?
Good morning. My name is Tim Breitbart from Bournemouth University in England. I have a question regarding the drivers behind that change. Because, Professor Pieth, you mentioned in your speech that probably the sponsors or the civil society or the regulators are not the right ones to, or haven't achieved enough pressure to actually initiate change. So I would be interested in your view, what are the drivers?
Sorry, the drivers?
Yes, what are the drivers for change? If it's not the pressure from civil society or the sponsors or the commercial interests or the regulators. And likewise, I would like to ask Dr. Zwanziger, because he, in his role as president of the German Football Association, he also started to engage with stakeholders on a more formal level, and they also implemented a road to sustainability, which also included some of those governmental and transparency and socio-political issues. What he thinks are the drivers for change within the football system. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Well, I think it's a very valid question, and of course, I started off by saying you, fans, civil society, academia, have played a big role in creating the atmosphere. People generally in FIFA, and this is quite widespread actually, I think you mentioned it as well, many of your colleagues are fed up. That was something that I was astonished. It was an interesting experience from an outsider at that Congress where there were well over 1,000 people. Many people walked up to you and said, go on, do it, do something, use your possibility, your options, especially those players that were there. Now, there were not many. I think amongst 1,400, I only saw 4 or 5 players, maybe I haven't seen all of them. They were saying, do something, this is really essential. Now, the regulators I mentioned, they are lame ducks. They could be pushed further. They alone won't do anything, but they might do something if you help create the atmosphere that is necessary. It's interesting what is happening in the Council of Europe. If you leave the Council of Europe, on the one side, if you look at the working groups of the Council of Europe, there's nothing much happening because it's behind closed doors. If you look at the European Parliament, that is creating more stimulus. The sponsors, I'm very disappointed, really, from what I've seen, but maybe I haven't explored the entire world of the sponsors. So it brings us back to the question of self-regulation. There are people within that body who, for different reasons, want to push You've mentioned that the current president has his reasons why he wants to push. Frankly, it's not for me to discuss them or so. This gives us an opportunity. If you use them, what is essential is he's not alone. He is around him. There are people who genuinely want a change. What I'm saying at the same time, there is pushback. There are people who are actually blocking. And if you know anything about politics, you can imagine in these bodies it's everything just 5 times worse because everybody is creating pacts with other people and trying to do things for certain reasons because they want something in return at a certain point. So it's very, very difficult from an outside perspective to actually discern why is this person going along with the first 5 counts and doesn't like the next 5 counts on our list. So it's a big negotiation scenario that we're in. I think we both of us had said at the moment you shouldn't underestimate the thrust that the current president is enacting because as these structures go, he is in a position to influence, for instance, Congress. If you did the same exercise totally bottom up, it would be far more difficult. I don't know if we would get anywhere at this given moment. So my suggestion is use what we can, but there is a component where I would really think we need more from your side. We need, many people are simply saying, well, we don't really want to talk about this external element in the EXCO, or we don't want to talk about the election of EXCO members by Congress. It's up to you to say this is fundamental. If you really want to, if you think our colleague Champagne has something when you listened to him yesterday, that's where you have to dig in.
Dr. Zwanziger, you want to add something?
Es gibt nach meiner Einschätzung niemand, weder aus dem Bereich der Sponsoren noch von Ländern, Staaten, Politik, die in der Lage wären, einen FIFA-Reformprozess durchzusetzen.
I don't think that anybody from our sponsors or from politics or anywhere who would be have a possibility to work through our reform work.
Und ich muss sagen, als jemand, der seit er denken kann, diesem Sport verbunden ist und viele Funktionen durchlaufen hat, würde ich es als ein Armutszeugnis empfinden, wenn wir uns durch den Staat zwingen lassen müssten, etwas Notwendiges zu tun.
And I've been involved in the sport ever since I could think, I can say, and I think it would really, really be very poor if we would have to let us be forced by the state to make reforms.
Der Weg ist, von innen heraus durch Überzeugungskraft Mehrheiten zu gewinnen. Das ist immer der Weg der Demokratie, nicht eine Revolution. Das hilft nicht.
It will always be from inside out we have to work. That is the way that we will have results. That is the way we will do it in a democratic way. It wouldn't help at all to have a revolution here. That doesn't help at all.
Es geht ja nicht nur um das Thema Korruption, es geht auch um die politisch-gesellschaftliche Wertschätzung des Sports für die Menschen in unserer Gesellschaft.
It's not only a question of corruption here, it's also the appreciation of sports in our society and the role that sports plays for everybody.
Der Kampf gegen Diskriminierung für Integration. Ja, gegen alle, ja, Einsatz für Minderheiten. Alles das muss politische Aufgabe von Sportverbänden sein, von innen heraus gestaltet und kommt.
Discrimination and equal rights, that is something that has to be attacked by the sport federations from inside out.
Dadurch gewinnst du Ansehen, dadurch gewinnst du Mitwirkung in der Gesellschaft insgesamt. Die Sponsoren, die Staaten, die Länder, die kritisch begleitenden Journalisten sind hilfreiche Partner auf diesem Weg. So sehe ich das. Sie sind hilfreiche Partner und dieser Einfluss, denke ich mal, ist groß genug, um den inneren Reformprozess zu gestalten.
That is the way you will get respect, and you need your partners here, and that will be the media, the critical media, it will be the state, the country's society, everybody, and in getting the respect from all these, you will be able to get forward with this stuff.
Mir hat ein namhafter Sponsor des DFB auf einem gemeinsamen Flug vor kurzem nach Warschau im Flugzeug gesagt, der Zwanziger, unser Sponsoring steht heute nicht nur unter dem sportlichen Erfolg der Nationalmannschaft, sondern auch darum, ob sie nachhaltig die Werte vertreten, die wir als Global Player auch vertreten müssen.
I was flying to Warsaw some time ago, and a sponsor was saying to me, the reason we are a sponsor here is not only the results that you produce within the sportive activities, it is also that you really represent the values in the global area that we want to represent also.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question? Please.
A question to Professor Pieth. Just about the
Can you, we know you, but maybe for the rest of the audience.
Sorry, my name is James Corbett, I'm a British journalist. A question for Professor Pieth about the reform process and some of the compromises that you've had to make. And we were talking before about the independent directors who wanted to bring on the federation to oppose to it. What drives these compromises? I mean, for instance, the federations aren't actually members of FIFA. At what point do you have to step back and say, well, we need to change this? And who in effect tells you to change it?
Well, you have to anticipate that the people coming from outside, they have usually, in my group, they usually have a business background or an NGO background, and from their perspective it would be quite logical to have outside directors in an institution. So that was the starting point. Obviously, we cannot totally dissociate ourselves from the environment. If you have, let's say, a situation where it's going to be either or, it's going to be an absolute no-go, there is a possible compromise that you have, for instance, you have those independents that are elected, take the audit and compliance boss who is independent, to be sitting in and listening what they're doing. Whether this person is going to cast a vote or not is not essential. It's essential that something is there. And the other person that we had identified as an essential person to sit in is the nomination person. Because what you cover with this would be people who are actually into personnel issues, financial issues, and all sorts of business decisions. That's the compliance side, so marketing and so on. What is not covered by the externals, they would probably abstain and leave when they're talking about genuine football issues. Whether the offside rules are changed, that's not the topic where we're really digging in. So that's a practical example of a compromise. Now, I think your group came out slightly differently on that one and was probably even tougher. And so this is quite interesting, an interesting debate. My fear is that if we go the way that we're going now, that they will simply cut that point and ditch it. And that's why I'm saying this is where people like you should come in and say, sorry, if this goes, it's hopeless. Then you've killed the most essential point. That's what I have to say to this.
Sorry, just to elaborate, who's the they that's a federation?
It's a complicated issue. I mean, you have many days. You have the EXCO as a first circle. You have then, of course, the confederations, which are very much involved in this issue. And for me, very difficult to identify the associations. So far, my experience of the associations, which everybody thinks they're the most democratic grouping, is that they're the silent majority in this Congress. If you've been to the Congress, no one has spoken. So I don't know these associations. I don't know what potential they have at all. If they don't speak, they're not there. But I think you know more about the inside difficulties there. For me, there is, at some points, there is a wall of saying, yeah, thanks, go away.
Also, von innen betrachtet ist das eigentlich alles ganz normal, was sich dort abspielt. Das ist auch in anderen Lebenssphären so.
Seen from the inside, that's quite normal, and that's like in all other aspects of life.
Wir haben eine Ausgangsbasis, einen Bestand. Wir fangen nicht bei Null an.
We have a starting point, and we are not starting from scratch.
Diese Ausgangsbasis bezogen auf Ihre Frage heißt, die Konföderationen sind im FIFA-Exekutivkomitee sehr stark.
And the starting point of the question was that the confederations are very strong in the FIFA.
Und es hat überhaupt nichts mit dem Reformprozess als solches zu tun. Sie wollen ihre Machtstrukturen natürlich möglichst nicht geschwächt sehen.
And it doesn't have anything to do really with the reform process, because of course they don't want to see that their powers will be limited.
Ein kleines Beispiel. Wie Sie wissen, wurde im Mai zum ersten Mal eine Frau in das Exekutivkomitee gewählt.
Just a little example. As we know, for the first time in May, there was a woman elected onto the executive committee.
Sie kam zusätzlich, als zusätzliches Mitglied, aus Afrika.
She was voted in as an extra person, and she came as an extra person from Africa.
Es gab Diskussionen über die Frage, ob durch diese zusätzliche Stimme aus Afrika das alte Prinzip, dass zwei Konföderationen allein nicht zu einer Mehrheitsbildung in der Lage waren, jetzt durchbrochen sei. Europa und Afrika hätten jetzt allein eine Stimmenmehrheit.
It was discussed that the old principle that two confederations alone could make a decision, if that could be changed now. Now we could see a situation coming where Europe and Africa alone could change things.
Das hat mit dem Reformprozess gar nichts zu tun, sondern einfach mit der Frage, wie kann ich Mehrheiten bilden, wenn es zum Beispiel darum geht, internationale Veranstaltungen veranstalten zu dürfen oder auch andere Entscheidungen zu treffen. Sie dürfen nicht übersehen, die FIFA ist in der ganzen Welt mit unterschiedlichen Aufgaben und Maßnahmen, Projekten tätig.
There's something to do with the reform process. It's just a question of how can we make majorities to make decisions about international events and other activities because FIFA is active on many fields.
Der zweite Punkt, wenn Sie Reformen ansprechen wie Amtszeitbegrenzung, treffen Sie Menschen. Menschen, die in Ämtern sind.
Another point is if you start looking at the term that a member can serve, then you are talking about people.
Da sind zum Beispiel Menschen dabei, die deutlich jünger sind am Lebensalter als ich, aber schon viele, viele Jahre in den Gremien.
There are people that are much younger in age than I am, but they have been serving for a much longer period.
Glauben Sie, dass da ein Sturm der Begeisterung ausbricht, wenn Herr Professor Pieth oder ich Ihnen sage, aber höchstens 2 Perioden insgesamt?
Do you think that there will be applause when Professor Pieth and I would say, you can only sit for 2 terms?
Also ein Stück Widerstand gegen Reformen hat viel mit Lebenssituationen zu tun, ohne dass man daraus gleich Reformunfähigkeit herleiten muss oder gar Korruptionsgedanken zu hegen hat. Das ist bei jeder Reform systemimmanent, denn ohne Menschen, ihre Stärken und ihre Schwächen geht es nun mal nicht.
So having an opposition to reforms is quite natural because it will always concern people, and it will be people with the strong sides and the weak sides, and without people you cannot make any changes at all.
Ich habe vorhin von dem Bild Regierung-Opposition gesprochen. Im Moment müssen viele Fußballfunktionäre bei der FIFA Regierung und Opposition gleichzeitig sein. Das ist nicht ganz so einfach.
I talked earlier about government and opposition. As we have it now, very many people in FIFA, they have to take on both roles, and that is not always easy.
Yeah, thank you for sharing these inner discussions, how FIFA and the executive committee in particular is working. One last question, because we are running out of time. Okay, only one hand, so it's not difficult to choose. It's you, but wait for the microphone.
Short question. My name is David Marowak from the University of Cape Town, South Africa. All presentations are about restructuring and reform at the head of FIFA. In my opinion, the dark corners of FIFA is actually situated at the football associations. So the question is, in terms of the process that's being established, how deep down will that reach into football association? Will that ultimately impact the success of our team? We make the entire system. Thanks.
Professor Pieth, are you ready to answer?
Yep. Well, first of all, of course, it's quite difficult to regulate directly into the periphery, if you want, into the individual associations. There are ways, though. Imagine an association receives money under one of those development projects, or is receiving money because they are hosting a competition. There is a local organizing committee and so on. So one way would be to very, very strictly supervise what is happening with those funds, something that has not been done strictly enough in the past. There are ways of doing that. Some of them are applied. One of the challenges is, for instance, to have those random checks that have been done, I don't know now, is it 10% or 20% that they are looking at every year, to beef that up and do much more auditing from the centre. They can do it as far as the money goes. The alternative is also, you mentioned a moment ago, that there is at least a subsidiary form of ethics. The ethics code applies if the local entity does nothing, or it is foreseeable that they're unable to do anything in a given situation, then the central ethics institutions can get active. That's another way of intervening, but one is quite hesitant to actually, from the center, directly regulate the associations.
Okay.
Ja, vielleicht darf ich einsetzen. Also das ist genau richtig, was Herr Professor Pieth sagt. Natürlich wollen die Mitgliedsverbände der FIFA im Rahmen ihrer jeweiligen staatlichen Gesetzgebung ihre Vereins- und Verbandsautonomie selbst ordnen.
I just want to add one sentence. It's very correct what was said. The different federations under FIFA want to regulate things according to their national legislation and get things through in that way.
Es gibt zwei Kernausnahmen.
There are two exceptions, two major exceptions.
Da alle Mitgliedsverbände den Reglementen der FIFA unterworfen sind,
All federations are, of course, subject to the statutes of FIFA.
gilt das Ethikreglement auch für alle Mitgliedsverbände der FIFA.
So the ethics regulation is valid for all federations within FIFA.
Natürlich müssen Verstöße vor Ort geahndet werden, aber wenn sie dort nicht geahndet werden, kann die unabhängige FIFA-Staatsanwaltschaft, sage ich einmal, eingreifen.
Of course, if there are any breach of the rules, then there will have to be sanctions on local level. But if nothing happens there, then the prosecutor, I'll call it, from FIFA can get active on behalf of FIFA.
Damit haben wir hier die gleiche Situation wie bei dem zweiten Punkt, den Sie kennen.
So we have the same situation as with the second point that you already know.
Das sind die Fußballregeln allgemein. Die gelten für alle. Allerdings wird der IFAB, so denke ich, noch eine gewisse Reform durchlaufen mit Blick auf etwas größere Transparenz seiner Entscheidungen.
That would be the football rules that are applicable, but the EFAP will also have to be reformed so that there will be more transparency in the decisions.
Thank you. I would like to conclude by thanking you, all of you, because you participate in this keynote session. You heard it. We need you. FIFA needs you. IFAB maybe needs you also. And I would like also to thank, of course, our two keynote speakers. Thank you very much.